Welcome, everyone. Please turn your attention to our interpretation team.
Hi there. My name is Erwin, and I'll be one of your Spanish interpreters. And this message will be broadcast in both English and Spanish. This session will provide American Sign Language interpretation along with Spanish interpretation simultaneously. Si necesita servicio de interpretación, por favor déjenos saber en el chat. Los intérpretes darán instrucciones antes de comenzar este seminario. In an effort to create a multilingual space and accessible space, we have limited use of the chat function. It is difficult to translate in real time, and it could be inaccessible to assistive devices. Please send questions, comments, or resources directly to the event host and co-host, who can read out the responses with the support to the interpreting team. En el esfuerzo de crear un espacio multilingüe y accesible, les pedimos que limiten el uso de la función de chat. Es difícil traducir en tiempo real y es posible que no sea accesible para todos los dispositivos de asistencia. Por favor, envíe las preguntas y comentarios o recursos directamente al anfitrión, como aparece en su pantalla, quien puede leer en voz alta las respuestas con el apoyo del equipo de interpretación. The live simultaneous interpretation and live text translation provided for this event is intended to facilitate communication during the event and to make it accessible to a wider audience. The speech in the original language is the most accurate record, and a translated transcript would constitute the most exact translation for the text speech. If you wish to cite or reproduce parts of the recorded interpretation, please contact NRCDV. La interpretación simultánea y traducción en vivo ofrecida para este evento tiene por objetivo facilitar la comunicación y es para hacerlo accesible a un público más amplio. El discurso en el idioma original es el registro más preciso del evento y una traducción traducida constituirá la traducción más exacta del texto o discurso. Si desea citar o reproducir partes de la interpretación grabada, póngase en contacto con NRCDV. To access interpretation for English or Spanish, please ensure that you select the interpretation globe on the bottom of your screen if you're using a computer, and if you're using a smart device, you'll see three little dots that say more. Then you'll be able to select English or Spanish, or the language in which you would like to listen to and participate during today's session. Si se está uniendo al webinario, al seminario a través de un computador, podrá hacer clic en el icono de un globo terráqueo que dice interpretación y puede seleccionar español o el idioma en el que desea escuchar y participar el día de hoy. Si se está uniendo a través de un dispositivo Smart, podrá hacer clic entre los tres puntitos que dice más, interpretación de idioma, y luego selecciona el idioma en el que desea escuchar y participar. Asegúrese de hacer clic donde dice Done o aplicar para que los ajustes sean aplicados. Gracias. Thank you. We may begin.
Thank you so much for those helpful housekeeping suggestions. And thank you again for joining us today. I'm Peri Branco. Welcome to this webinar, Stalking and Intimate Partner Violence. I'm with the National Resources Center on Domestic Violence. I have brown skin and long, dark, curly hair. I'm wearing a green top and yellow gold jewelry. We gratefully acknowledge the native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home here today. I'm enjoying from the land of various peoples, including the Catawba, Shira, Sugari, Wateree, and Waxhaw. If this is your first time that you join one of NRCDV's Training Institute webinars, we would like to welcome you and suggest that you visit our website and follow us on social media so that you can learn about our exciting projects and initiatives. NRCDV is a national technical assistance provider working to strengthen the capacity of programs responding to domestic violence victims and their families. We work with many other organizations and partners who bring various expertise, backgrounds, and perspectives to improve community response to domestic violence and prevent its occurrence. Today's webinar, we will explore the critical links between stalking and intimate partner violence in recognition of National Stalking Awareness Month 2024. We are joined by our colleagues at the Stalking Prevention, Awareness and Resources Center, SPARC. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Natalie Ivey, she, her, hers, training and criminal justice specialist at SPARC. We are sharing the link to Natalie's bio in the chat and invite you to learn more about our amazing presenter. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patty. I am delighted to be here and excited to be digging into this topic specifically as we are recognizing stalking this month, our National Stalking Awareness Month, but also understand for the folks who are doing the work in the field of domestic violence, this is an issue that you're going to be dealing with on a regular basis, and one maybe you've already recognized in the work that you're doing. Or hopefully you'll learn some things today to take back to the work, and we can better improve our response to stalking specifically, particularly when it's intersecting with domestic violence. So as Patty mentioned, I work with the, my clicker is getting a little crazy. I'm working with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, and you can check out our site. I'm going to be referencing our site with a lot of the resources that we discussed today. But one of our goals overall and the work that we do is to make the hard work that you all are doing in your areas a little easier. So we offer our resources online and hopefully can help lift the load of all the things that you're taking on. If you are looking for a specific resource and can't find it on our site, we encourage you to reach out to us and let us know and see if we can't help find some help for you or develop a resource that would be beneficial for your the work that you're doing. You can also follow us on all of your social media. You'll see our sense of humor there, as our handle is Follow Us Legally, right? But we hope that that sticks with you a little bit and you can see all of the work that we're doing every day, year round. So when we talk about stalking, we want to make sure that we have a universal understanding of this definition and that we're all on the same page about the ways that it might present. And the ways that we think about stalking are kind of in two big categories, right? Particularly when we're talking to audiences that are from a multitude of jurisdictions. We have our behavioral definition, which we're going to discuss today and focus on a little bit more closely. But I'd also encourage you to dig into the legal or the statutory definition for your jurisdiction. We know that stalking is defined as a crime in all of the jurisdictions in the United States on a federal level, within our tribal communities, on college campuses. It's addressed within our Title IX provisions. So it's really important that you take a look at those statutes specifically as you are responding to stalking in your jurisdiction. But in general, we want to make sure that we have a kind of common behavioral definition for stalking, because one of the things that I always want to emphasize when we are working with individuals who've been affected by stalking is, sometimes we're wearing a lot of hats, and one of them might be a hat that is looking at statutory interpretation or, a criminal legal response. And that is valuable, but there's great value sometimes in just acknowledging someone's experience and saying, even if it's not meeting a statutory definition, to be able to acknowledge that what someone is experiencing is actually stalking behavior. And that validation and acknowledgement can go a long way in giving that individual the language that they need to deal with their experience and to access resources that are helpful to them. So when we talk about the behavioral definition, we're looking at a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable fear for that person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. That on the surface is a relatively easy definition, right? It's not overly complicated, but we want to make sure that we are digging into some of the details here so that we have really broad perspective and understanding of all of the ways that stalking might present in the cases and the clients that we're working with. So when we talk about a pattern of behavior, we are talking about more than one event, right? That there is something beyond a singular event that could be tied together. And a lot of times in our statutes, we're going to see this described as a course of conduct. And your statute might describe that course of conduct uniquely. For the most part, we see across the country that's defined as 2 or more events. Some of our jurisdictions in this country require 3 events. I don't know that I've seen more than 3 events being required, but we're seeing a number of events needing to be kind of evaluated to determine if stalking is occurring. Again, not overly complicated, and this might seem obvious, but one of the things I always want to point out, because this is sometimes the first way that stalking is not adequately identified, is because we can't get to a pattern of behavior or a course of conduct if we're not counting the first incident. And what I mean by that is if we have a person who is experiencing stalking behavior, they may make an informal report to their boss if they're late to work that day because the offender has, prevented them from being on time. So they might make that first report, right? They might make a second report, an informal report to a family member. Man, my ex-boyfriend is getting really weird. This is getting uncomfortable. He called me 47 times last night, right? They might make a third report to campus police if they are using or trying to promote their own safety on campus. And then they might make the fourth report to law enforcement if there's property damage at their house, if the tires have been slashed, etc. But you can see how all of these people in our community might be trained to respond to each of those individual reports, but they might not have the capacity or the bandwidth or even the knowledge to think about how those incidences are actually all connected and to see the course of conduct on the third or the fourth incident. So we want to make sure, particularly for the victim advocates in our audience, that we are assisting individuals with kind of collecting that evidence, collecting that data, collecting the narrative so that it can be more easily identified by our law enforcement partners and our prosecution partners. Now, the other part of this definition that can kind of get tricky is we have to see that that behavior is directed at a specific person. Now, that can be overt, right? It could be an offender calling a victim directly, but it also can be subtle, and it can be through third parties. So if an offender wanted to target me, for example, an easy way to do that without actually making contact with me would be maybe to make a contact with my child. Maybe my child comes home from school and says, hey, I met a strange man as I was walking into school, and he said, how's your mom doing? Did she have a good time in West Virginia last week, right? And maybe my child doesn't think anything more of it. He seemed nice. He was friendly. But it has sent a clear message to me, right? If I identify that as an offender and I'm concerned about a stalker in my life, it has told me that that individual knows where my children go to school, what time they're going to school, where I was last week, if I actually was in West Virginia, right? That all of that information, which can be pretty terrifying, has been communicated to me without actually contacting me directly. So those behaviors, that contact can still be counted as we are looking for that pattern or that course of conduct. And it's important that we as advocates or responders or helpers in a situation are aware of that, and we provide that information to the folks that we're working with, because it's also likely that a victim may not have the perspective that type of behavior counts, right? Well, he wasn't calling me directly, so why would I even report that? Why would I tell you that this happened to me? Because it didn't actually happen to me, it happened to my kid. So we want to make sure that we're asking critical questions and we're looking for these dynamics. And you'll probably hear me say this over and over again today, but when we talk about identifying stalking, it's one of those kind of unique forms of victimization that does not just naturally or inherently come to the surface. It's oftentimes a dynamic that we have to ask about. We have to ask critical questions and we have to listen critically. And then we got to follow up on some of those answers. It takes work on our end to really adequately identify stalking when it's occurring with the folks that we're working with. So this last part is talking about a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer that substantial emotional distress. And what we're going to see a lot of times is that fear, the impact of the offender's behavior, right? Whether it's emotional distress or fear, harassment, annoyance, that impact oftentimes is going to sit underneath the umbrella of context. And we'll dig into that in just a bit, but think about that. Oftentimes, even that impact is not overt. It's not easily identifiable on the surface. It takes some questions and some digging to really figure out what's happening and how it's affecting that person. So this is that context. I'm glad it went ahead and played. But this is that context clue, right? This is kind of what we're getting at when we talk about context and the effect on a person. And this is a little clip that we use just to illustrate oftentimes how a person who is experiencing stalking behavior, how they might present to society, whether it's law enforcement or victim advocates or prosecutors or even their family or friends, is their reaction to behavior might present kind of like this woman in the video, right? Now, sometimes I feel like this video is not a great one to use because I feel like some people in our audience might relate with her, you know, off the top, and seeing a spider in their house might cause that level of fear, right? But if we are looking at it a little bit more cynically, and we're watching specifically that male's response to her behavior, we can see that, you know, he's looking at her kind of as if this is an overreaction. This is, you know, not reasonable to what we're seeing here or what we're experiencing. There's not a real urgency on his part to respond, right? And it's kind of confusing to him why she all of a sudden is having this extreme reaction. But the context behind that might actually make her reaction make sense. So I think this little clip might actually be from a Super Bowl ad many, many years ago. So the silly version of it is he goes over to kill the spider and the spider's able to pick him up and slam him against the wall, right? Obviously, that's a silly, you know, exaggeration of what context could be. But if that were true, we could see that her reaction was legitimate, right? But the other ways that this might actually play out in real time is if we gave context to this scenario. And that might be, you know, she spent 3 weeks in the hospital last year because she was bit by a black widow spider and got a horrific infection and almost died, right? That's context. Those are details and facts that we would not necessarily know just by looking at the situation. But once we know them, we look at her reaction and we say, yeah, that's probably legitimate, right? That's a reasonable reaction considering her experience. And so when we think about that, we want to make sure that we are grounding our questions and our support for the folks who are experiencing stalking in that context component. that we're looking for contextual clues to help us understand how this behavior affects the person who is on the receiving end of the behavior. And one of the ways that stalking kind of flies under the radar and is a really effective tool for abusers is that the behaviors in and of themselves may not be overtly criminal. If an individual is driving down a street, it's not necessarily illegal, right? But if he is driving down the street knowing that the victim can see him, and he has already communicated to the victim, I'm watching you, I'm paying attention to everything you're doing, that transportation changes meaning, right? And so we have to be really cognizant as we are listening to what individuals are reporting, what they're experiencing, and understanding what context might be underneath the surface. What we see oftentimes with abusers, particularly offenders within a domestic violence and intimate partner violence dynamic, is symbolic violence. And that becomes very difficult to detect for outsiders, but is an incredibly effective tool for terrorizing and controlling an individual. So a quick example of that might be if an individual was in an abusive relationship and the offender in the relationship, when things were getting exceptionally violent, when things were escalating, the abuser might have said, I'm going to kill you one day, and when I do, I'm going to put white roses on your casket. And that might have just been a common threat that was used within that really abusive, dangerous dynamic, right? And if the victim flees a relationship, is seeking safety, maybe has moved to a new city, a new state, thinks that they are living in a place that's secret, that nobody knows about, and maybe has started a new job. And if they walk in on the first day of their new job and they see a dozen white roses on their desk, that sends a very different message than what their coworkers are probably thinking, right? Their coworkers' response is probably, oh my goodness, this is so sweet. Oh, how romantic. This is so kind. Who sent these to you, right? But the victim knows exactly the message that is being sent, and it's actually a message of lethality and danger and violence. And so we can see right off the bat with that symbolic violence, A, how effective it is, but B, how difficult it is for a victim to articulate to others the meaning behind that, right? It kind of requires a big, long narrative. So when we look at context specifically, this is kind of an example of how that might play out. This is from a police report with an agency that we partnered with. And this was, they had gone back through to audit some of the reports that they had taken to see if there were times that they may have missed stalking behavior. And I think this is a really great example of how context changes not only the law enforcement response, but the entire narrative, right? So we see here at the beginning of the report, victim advised on today's date at approximately 800 hours, when she got into her car to head to work, her car doors were locked, and on the driver's seat was a Corona beer bottle cap. And, you know, kind of the universal, maybe outside the scope of victim service folks, you know, the average Joe response might be, she called the police because of a beer cap, right? In fact, I would kind of be curious if you thought about your own area, your own jurisdiction, your own law enforcement agency, if a report came in to law enforcement on 911 or maybe even the non-emergency line, and this was the report, what kind of response would they receive from law enforcement? You know, we do these trainings all over the country, and we get to talk to a lot of folks and get a lot of great perspective. And I've heard a wide range. You know, some folks say she wouldn't get any response. You know, they might take a report, but that's going to be it. I think the most responsive I've heard is some jurisdictions that say, Yeah, they would probably follow up with her in a day or two. Maybe somebody would come out and talk with her. It might just be that this just gets noted, right? So as we think about this scenario, I do want to take just a second to think about what questions you might have to figure out context, right? How do you get to context? How do you figure out what the underlying narrative might be behind this singular behavior? And you might be curious, some folks might say, how did the person get into her car if it was locked? That's valid, right? Where was her car parked, right? Sometimes when I'm training law enforcement, they want to be a little bit more focused on the logistics, right? The facts of the case and how this invasion of her vehicle might have played out. We might be curious about the beer bottle cap. Maybe what does that represent to her, right? What was the significance of that? Why did she identify that as something unique or threatening? Right? So when we start to ask these questions, but I just want to point out there that all of those questions, that's kind of on the burden of law enforcement, right? If they don't ask those questions, context is not uncovered. But if they take the time to ask those questions, they might see the rest of the scenario and actually start to identify stalking behavior. So that very first sentence we just read, but starting on the second sentence, it says, victim stated yesterday she celebrated her 2-year anniversary of being sober, and she had received messages from people in her AA group congratulating her on her 2-year sobriety. She believes that suspect placed the beer cap in her car to mess with her emotionally, as seeing anything related to alcohol is a trigger to her. She believes that suspect is monitoring her messages, as that is the only way suspect would know about the anniversary. Does this give us a lot more context about what she's experiencing? And it really helps us understand her own mentality and her own response, right? It helps us understand the impact that this beer bottle cap actually had on her. And one thing I always want to point out when we are looking at this scenario, because I do not think this is a coincidence or by mistake, is that her abuser, her offender, chose a symbol that was related to her sobriety. Because I'm curious, I'm wondering if the offender knew that offering up that information, giving the rest of the story, giving context, would require her to disclose to law enforcement that she's in recovery. And maybe that is a personal matter that she does not want to overly share. Maybe it is something that she struggles with sharing. Maybe it comes with stigmas in the community that she's in. I think about, I've lived in a lot of small towns in my life, and I think about, oftentimes the law enforcement officer who's showing up might also be a family member or a friend, or you go to church with them, or you teach their kid in your classroom, right? There could be a lot of connections and a lot of consequences for her, social consequences, and just even sharing the information that gives context. Do I think the offender just lucked out in choosing a symbol that had potential social stigma with it? Absolutely not. I think, in fact, if we ask more critical questions, we would find that the offender knew specifically that this was a sensitive subject for her, and that it would be much more difficult for her to give context to actually achieve a response from law enforcement. So when we talk about the stalking definitions, we did discuss that behavioral definitions. As I mentioned, we have our criminal definitions, and I just want to make sure that we are aware of the statutory definitions that are out there that will kind of guide. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Will guide us in specifically partnering with our law enforcement folks or with prosecution in our jurisdictions. So one thing that you can do, unless you love to hang out in your local law library, and maybe you do, but you can also go to our website. We have an interactive map with all of the jurisdictions in our country, and you can click on your jurisdiction and it should pull up your stalking statute. So, and we update those pretty regularly. You can check those out just as a quick access and quick resource. I would also encourage you to have those handy if you are engaging partners in your community within the criminal legal system who are hesitant or reticent to respond to stalking behaviors. So you might have a law enforcement officer, maybe a new officer, maybe one that hasn't received stalking specific training. And what we hear sometimes from advocates is, you know, we're reporting this and they're saying they can't charge it. We're reporting this and there's no response from our criminal legal partners. Sometimes there's benefit to having those stalking statutes and having an opportunity to sit down with your law enforcement partners and to explain how and understand how the case that you're working on or the client that you're working with doesn't necessarily meet that statutory language or provisions. There might be things about it that will inform your advocacy or your support of that person, or it might be an opportunity for you to inform some of your partners to really take a look at those stalking statutes and see how the law applies to behaviors. So when we talk about stalking specifically and the prevalence of stalking, we're going to see the data shows that it is just as, if not more prevalent than some of our other intimate partner crimes, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault. It is tracking right up there with some of those other crimes that we oftentimes kind of have a communal response for. So whether that be domestic violence or sexual assault, we don't see the same response or preparation for stalking in our communities, though the prevalence is the same. We see that nearly 1 in 3 women are affected in their lifetime and nearly 1 in 6 men. We're certainly not seeing that prevalence play out in our criminal legal system when it comes to charging crimes. Something we'll kind of talk about a little bit more in this presentation. When we see stalking occurring, we do see statistically that women are more likely than men to experience stalking. We see that there oftentimes is a connection between the victim and the offender, but we also know, unlike some of our other kind of high risk and lethal crimes like intimate partner violence, like sexual assault, we see that there is a chunk of victimization here. And some of our newer studies say getting close to half of our victim population might be experiencing stalking from someone that they do not know. Now, we really want to point that out because, as I mentioned earlier, not only is our community and our resources oftentimes primed and ready to respond to domestic violence, sexual violence, but oftentimes those resources are centered on or kind of grounded in crimes that are happening within relationships, relational crimes, right? And we recognize that those are serious and require a robust response. But if we have a victim who is experiencing stalking from a stranger, it might actually contribute to stigmatization for them. And it might also cut them off from resources if they do not have a relationship with that offender. So something to think about within your own agency or within your own community, if you have victims who are experiencing stalking, stranger stalking specifically, do they know where they can go for resources? Are there resources, right? And what does that look like from your own community response? We want to make sure that we're prepared to deal with those cases too, and that they are on our radar as well. We do see the majority of victims report that offender is male. And we see the highest rate of victimization among young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds. So something to be thinking about, particularly as we are looking and working in our community with prevention education, that we're incorporating that stalking component in those conversations and that kind of emotional and intellectual training that we do for our young folks. As I mentioned earlier, we do see predominantly that many of our offenders are current or former intimate partners. An acquaintance might include things like neighbors. Maybe you go, you're in the same social circles within your community, coworkers, former coworkers, individuals that you know and you recognize, but you don't necessarily have a relationship with. We see family members also make up a small chunk of some of our offender statistics, and that's also important to keep in mind because that can make it difficult to recognize as well. Those dynamics when the victimization is happening within a family setting, the dynamics can become even more difficult to detect and sometimes for our first responders to wade through. So understanding stalking behaviors. Why is this a dynamic? Why are abusers and individuals engaging in stalking behavior? And though we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, I think there's value in thinking through some of these motivations and making sure that our community is not contributing to any of these motivations. So we know that stalking behaviors are an incredibly effective way to control and to coerce a person. It is essentially gaslighting and terrorizing an individual in broad daylight, right? Without really anyone responding or recognizing what's happening. So, that last bullet point there, because they can, I think is one of our most important motivations to focus on. What that says to me, because they can, is that they know either through experience or through the connections that they might have in their community that law enforcement is not going to respond, or that there will be no criminal legal consequences for their behavior, or that it'll be incredibly difficult for the victim to report and to identify what's happening, right? This is kind of the most extreme forms of manipulation and coercive control of a person. So we see other motivations that we don't want to overlook because they certainly are relative to the folks that we potentially are working with. We do see stalking particularly with sexual violent crimes. We see it being used on the front end as a form or a way to plan to commit a crime. We see stalking behavior kind of interwoven with what we oftentimes term as grooming behavior. So maybe intentionally making a connection with a potential victim and using that connection, building a relationship, asking questions with the intention of identifying vulnerabilities, and then using those vulnerabilities to facilitate the crime. So we might see that with a singular sexual assault. We also might see that with sex trafficking specifically, if we are looking to, if an exploiter or a trafficker is looking to identify a potential victim to exert control over and to enter into kind of the cycle of exploitation. We see these other forms of kind of power and control, coercion, as we talked about. We do see stalking occur after relationships have ended, particularly when relationships have abusive dynamics that were involved. But it's important that we note as well that oftentimes we kind of associate stalking with a post-relationship behavior. But the reality is stalking can happen while two individuals are in a relationship. The offender, the abuser might be engaging and using stalking behaviors to exert that power and control. So when we talk about common stalking behaviors, we want to think broadly and really have kind of a kind of wide perspective for all of the ways that this might present with the folks that we're working with, or play out with the criminal activity in our community. So I think about the SLY framework. This is a framework that we adopted from a researcher that we work closely with, in partnership with. But to me, I don't know if anybody on this call can relate. I can remember when I started work in the domestic violence field and working in a community where the general perception of domestic violence was a black eye, right? A physical injury. And it was really difficult for our community to understand all the ways that power and control and abusive behavior could be presenting within a relationship. That's one of the reasons the power and control wheel was such a valuable tool in helping our audience kind of broaden their understanding of the ways that domestic violence can actually occur and present within relationships. So similarly, I think about the SLY framework, and maybe this will broaden your own perspective, or maybe it's a resource or a tool that you can share with your own community partners to help broaden their perspective. Because what we see with stalking is kind of a similar societal pigeonhole, right, of how that presents. And that stereotypical stalker kind of elicits an image of someone with binoculars in the bushes looking through someone's window, right? Of course, if that was occurring, that would be stalking behavior, no doubt. But there's actually a lot of different ways that stalkers can engage in stalking behavior that might be much, much more difficult to detect. So we can dig into these categories, but I do want to point out these are truly kind of Venn diagrams. There can be behaviors that live in multiple categories. They're not independent buckets. So as we walk through these, you might think of some of these scenarios or maybe some behaviors that you've witnessed or you've observed in the cases that you've worked, and you'll see that they can fall under multiple categories. But when we talk about surveillance specifically, we talk about some of that stereotypical tracking, right? And it might be physically tracking someone. We might see, though, technology facilitates the ability to track someone or survey someone in a way that's much more subtle, right? Much more difficult to detect, rather than individual in the bushes with binoculars. An app or a platform or tracking technology can actually facilitate surveillance behaviors without detection. Can be very difficult to detect. But we see this as following, showing up at places where they know that the victim might be, obtaining information about the victim, as we talked about that grooming mechanism. And we also see the proxy stalking within the surveillance category. So when we talk about proxy stalking, we're talking about using third parties to assist the stalker in their surveillance. There's kind of two ways that that might play out. It might be intentional or I guess I could say almost like consensual proxy stalking. I oftentimes think of this playing out particularly with our younger population, but maybe there was a bad breakup and one of the parties is engaging in stalking behavior after the breakup. They're upset about that rejection, as we talked about, as a potential motivation. And so they kind of get their friends in on the stalking behavior. And so maybe the victim goes out to dinner on a Friday night and the ex-partner's best friend is their server. And the server says, hey, I'm going to tell so-and-so that you were here tonight and who you were here with. I think they'll be really interested to know that, right? So that's kind of that consensual proxy stalking. The stalker is using third parties to collect information about the victim. But what oftentimes is even more difficult to detect is when we have non-consensual or unknowing proxy stalking. And that might look like a stalker who maybe walks down the street and sees a neighbor of their victim and says, hey, I'm friends with Natalie and we were out late last night. and she wasn't answering my text, but I'm worried that she got home okay. Do you happen to know if she's home? Did she make it home all right? And the neighbor, thinking that they're being neighborly or kind, says, oh yeah, she's home. She was walking her dog this morning. She's fine. Don't worry about it. And so now the stalker has gained information about the victim through that third party without the third party really even knowing that they were involved. So something to be thinking about, again, as we're asking those critical questions. We see life invasion as another category of stalking behavior. And this is just truly kind of inserting themselves into the victim's life in a way that is unwanted and causes kind of stress, trauma, humiliation, annoyance, harassment for the victim, right? This might be through technology. Maybe it is excessive contact, 300 text messages in an hour, maybe calling from various numbers, maybe calling from blocked numbers, maybe using spoofing apps to call and sound like you're someone else. We also see life invasion can play out in other arenas and really have significant consequences for the victim. So it might be calling the victim at work repeatedly, so much so that the victim loses their job or loses their shift or, receives some frustration from their boss. We see that at school. It can happen. It can play out in a lot of different arenas. And sometimes, especially those arenas that are outside the home, can be even more difficult for the victim to deal with. And as I said, have graver consequences for them. We also see stalking behavior kind of fall into this interference category. This is just kind of messing up the victim's life, all the ways that you could mess up a victim's life. We think about cases where the offender maybe was engaging in a lot of stalking behavior, but that stalking behavior for the most part stayed within the home, right? Maybe it was really abusive. Maybe it was, but it was just directed at the victim, and it was something the victim was managing, particularly if the victim has been in a relationship with the offender for an extended period of time. They have learned to cope and to manage some of that abusive behavior. But the interference component can sometimes take that abuse to the next level. So think about a case my director had been involved with where a victim reported that the individual was tanking her Google reviews. She had a local business in town, and the offender was making false accounts on Google, and it maybe whatever Google or platform was where she was advertising her business, but was just leaving terrible reviews, and her professional ratings were plummeting. And that was her livelihood. That was, something that was beyond what she was used to managing with this abuser. And that's what she ended up reporting to law enforcement, was this behavior that was affecting her ability to be financially independent. And it was difficult for law enforcement to see through that singular incident, right? Because their first response sometimes to that type of behavior might be, that's a civil matter, this isn't criminal, this is something you need to deal with in a different arena. But unfortunately, they had been trained, they asked critical questions, and they were able to discover that this interference behavior really just the tip of the iceberg, that there had been a lot of abusive and controlling behavior that went below it. So again, just something to keep in mind as you are working with individuals and working with clients, that they may not come to you and overtly, disclose, I'm a victim of stalking. What they might be reporting is the thing that is the most difficult for them to manage, or the thing that feels the most threatening to them in the moment. And so we want to make sure that we're asking those follow-up questions to really figure out all of the ways that this might be kind of showing up in the victim's life. So intimidation is our last category. As we talked already about that symbolic violence, we want to make sure anytime a victim is reporting behavior, reporting gifts, reporting, situations that maybe on the surface are confusing or feel innocuous, that feel hard to understand why those are threatening, those are the scenarios or the specific situations that we really need to follow up on. And we're asking some really critical questions to help us understand the context. And then particularly as advocates, so that we can help them communicate that with our criminal legal partners to get the response that they need for that symbolic violence. Oop. All right. So when we talk about stalking and intimate partner violence specifically, what we're going to see is that stalking intersects with intimate partner violence fairly regularly. In fact, I would be curious to know, for folks on the call who've been doing this work for any period of time, if there are cases that you have worked that you're now thinking about, right? Oh, yeah, there was stalking. I struggle, even the cases that I've worked as an advocate, as a prosecutor, I oftentimes struggle to think about cases that I worked that didn't involve stalking. Almost all of them had some element of stalking to them. But what we see, and this is just a quick little snapshot from a couple of different reports, is that criminal legal response is oftentimes not designed or prepared to identify and to respond to stalking specifically. What we might see is a criminal legal response, and they charge, an intimate partner violence crime. Maybe they charge a domestic assault. But we don't see that same type of responsiveness within our criminal legal system to stalking specifically. And that's not a statement against the criminal legal system. That is a really kind of an observation about our systems as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, even some of our victim service agencies may not highlight that they serve victims of stalking. They may not be focusing on stalking specifically. Oftentimes at our agency, we kind of get a little bit sore about the response to stalking. We joke about it. It's oftentimes considered and stalking, right? That we as a community have kind of this preparation to respond to things like domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, and the stalking kind of gets thrown in there on the end. So we want to make sure that we're assessing that on the front end, that our community is ready and prepared to respond. As I mentioned earlier, that power and control wheel, right? How valuable that is, that Duluth model from them, their power and control wheel tool and the resource that they developed. It was so helpful for folks to understand all the ways that intimate partner violence can play out, right? All of the different ways that a person might engage in that behavior. But what we see, if we take a look at that wheel, which I'm sure you are all pretty familiar with, is that stalking behaviors, those categories that we talked about, right, can kind of fit into each of these categories. So I always feel like I'm kind of dating myself when I say this, but when I first started working domestic violence cases, I would hear from victims who would say things like, I can't come to the shelter because he's tracking my odometer, right? And he knows how many miles are on my odometer in my car, and he's going to check it when he gets home. Now, as I said, I always feel like that dates myself. I've had some audience members who don't even know what an odometer is anymore. But, that's how we used to be tracking folks before we had things like technology and GPS and cell phones and all of those things. But that surveillance, right, that behavior was not an unusual thing for us to hear in a domestic violence agency, but we weren't necessarily identifying that as stalking. We were just kind of associating that with the abuser's behavior. Yeah, he's a bad abuser. He's an effective abuser. He's manipulative. He's controlling. But we weren't really digging out and pulling out that was actually surveillance behavior, and it was actually stalking behavior. And again, you can think of a million different examples, and maybe from, like I said, some cases that you've worked, where we kind of lump all of this abusive behavior in together under one umbrella without actually parceling out the stalking behavior when it happens. And I'm going to take a quick break because I think someone might have asked a question, and I will address those so we don't get too far down the road if anybody had a question about a specific topic that we were talking about.
Hi, Natalie. This is Brecken in the chat. Yeah, we just had a question from Amanda a few minutes ago asking if stalking charges are held higher than domestic violence charges.
That's a great question. And we will talk a little bit about prosecutorial strategy here at the end. And the short answer to your question is it depends, right? I am a recovering attorney, and so I'll default to being an attorney with that answer with it depends. That's not incredibly helpful, but you do have to look at your local statute to see how stalking is addressed. Now, one thing I will say, and reviewing statutes across the country, is that oftentimes stalking charges specifically can escalate faster. And what I mean by that is if an individual is convicted of stalking, that first conviction might be a misdemeanor level, right? But what we see is if there are subsequent convictions, even if it's not involving the same victim, if it's just that this person is engaging in stalking behavior again, it can escalate to a felony. I was in Oklahoma last week, and they have some statutes that escalate pretty quickly for offenders who are convicted multiple times for the same types of behavior. So it's not always considered to be a higher level crime than domestic violence across the board, but it does oftentimes allow for prosecutors to build off of that first conviction when it comes to kind of the legal consequences for those crimes. Does that answer the question, Amanda? And if not, feel free to follow up in the Q&A. Okay, perfect. That's a great question, though. So what is the value? We talked about not always identifying stalking behavior when we're responding to intimate partner violence or sexual assault. Why is it important to do so? You know, sometimes we feel like we don't need to add another, checkbox to our list of things that we're doing. But the reality is there is great value in identifying stalking behavior with the cases that you're working. One of which is prosecutorial strategy, right? And again, we'll dig into that a little bit more at the end of this. But even from a victim service perspective, and probably most importantly, from a victim safety perspective, it's really important that we are identifying that stalking behavior and recognizing the risk that it might create for the victim. So when we see victims of intimate partner violence who the offender is engaging in that stalking behavior, we're going to see all of these factors. There's going to be a higher likelihood that all of these factors might occur. So if you're like me, and again, you've done this work for a little bit of time, all of these factors are kind of those factors that make the hair on your arms stand up, right? They're the components of cases that make us concerned about lethality, particularly, but certainly about the immediate safety of the person that we're working with. So when we are working with an individual who has experienced stalking behaviors, we want to be really cognizant of that lethality factor and that we're safety planning and preparing them based on this data and what we know to be true. And what is exceptionally concerning about stalking behaviors is if we are engaging with those victims and we're overlooking the stalking behaviors, we're overlooking the lethality components, we really could be doing an extreme disservice to the folks that we're working with. So this is looking at some of those big picture lethality risks for intimate partner homicide. We're going to see stalking as number 8. There's a 3-fold increase in risk of homicide. But I always going to point out too, there are things on this list that I think might also intersect with stalking behavior. So if you're identifying stalking behavior, there's probably a high likelihood that you're going to also be identifying the jealousy, right? Jealousy component. you probably are going to be identifying the controlling behaviors component. Depending on the threats or the type of behavior the stalker has engaged in, we might be seeing things like the threat of harm or the threat of use of a weapon. And so you can see very quickly how stalking behavior kind of compounds all of these lethality risks. It's something that we certainly need to be paying attention to as we work with folks and are preparing them to promote their own safety and understand kind of the seriousness of the situation that they're facing. So when we talk about identifying stalking, we talked about the importance of it. How do we identify stalking? And I know that I'm probably preaching to the experts here, but one of the things that we always want to encourage is asking critical and detailed kind of behavioral questions, not asking about the victimization on its face necessarily. This is what I mean by that. If you are screening for stalking and your screening consists of, have you been stalked? You might get some disclosures, but the quality of the answers that you receive is probably not going to be exceptionally high for a lot of different reasons, right? One of which might be that the victim has the same misconceptions or misunderstandings about what stalking behavior actually is. So, we might hear a victim say, no, I'm not being stalked. Well, yeah, he calls me all the time from numbers that I've blocked, but that's just what he does. That's what he does when he gets angry, right? That's what happens when things are escalating. So they may be categorizing these behaviors, recognizing them, but categorizing them as something not stalking related. So we want to really ask about the behaviors themselves to help the victim self-actualize. Oh, yeah, that does happen. And also help us to really understand what's happening within a relationship or within a victimization. So these are kind of big picture behavioral questions that you can ask. And as you can see there, they are associated with those 4 big categories within the SLI framework. But I would encourage you too, if you are asking about any of these behaviors, the more nuanced, the more detailed, the more specific you can be, the higher quality the answers will be, the more confident you can be that you really screened to determine if stalking was present in that individual's victimization or relationship. One of the resources that we recommend, because I know the task that I've just given you is a big one, right? To ask detailed and complex questions, that's a lot. And it's kind of an endless universe, right? You could go on and on and on. There is also a resource that is available for free that is a stalking specific harassment and risk profile. So I don't think we would ever offer this as an alternative to the services that you're already offering, but we think that it is really valuable as a supplement to the services and the care and the case coordination that you are currently providing. And what we love about this profile specifically is that it asks those behavioral specific questions, but it also provides the victim with a risk profile and a narrative of their victimization. So when you go through this profile, and I would really encourage those of you who serve as advocates or those of you who are in a position that might be assisting with safety planning to take a look at this tool, take a look at this resource. Do it on the front end so that you're prepared when somebody is in your office or accessing your resources, that you know what's out there and what's available. But you're going to see that this assessment is I think it's about 40, 45 questions. Now, if you're like me, when I learned about this assessment and based on my work with victims in the field, I thought, that is not accessible. That's a long assessment. There's no way. I don't have time. I would not have time for that. But what I've actually found with this assessment, and I've done this a number of times with audiences all over the country, the reality is these questions, because they are yes or no to behavioral, just behaviors within the relationship, it typically takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. It's really not that time intensive. But it's also not necessarily designed for victims to utilize and for it to be a wholly trauma-informed response to their victimization. The questions are kind of analytical. They are data-driven. And so I think there is a lot of value in an advocate accessing this assessment in partnership with a person who's experiencing stalking behaviors, so that the advocate can ask the questions and follow up on the questions and listen to the answers in a trauma-informed way, so that we're never contributing to any kind of further victimization or traumatization for individuals who've already experienced stalking. And the benefit of the risk profile, I will say to you before I move on, is it does create kind of a narrative that collects information of the victim's experience in a kind of easily readable or digestible kind of format. And what I mean by that is it takes the lift off victims, oftentimes specifically with stalking. We want victims to be their own investigators, their own evidence collectors, their own prosecutors, to collect all of this data about what's happened to them, to put it in a really clean and easily understandable case presentation, and then to present it in a way that everybody immediately understands. That's really unreasonable, right? Not only is it unjust, but it's unreasonable. What this profile can do is collect that information that the victim is giving and put it in a narrative and make it easier for him or her to go back and to refer to that and kind of see what they have experienced and share that with others in a quick and easy way to kind of communicate their own experience. So I think it has great value, particularly if that victim is working in partnership with criminal legal partners. It helps maybe some of those partners catch up a little bit faster. So, we always want to emphasize when we are talking about safety and safety planning that we are grounding our response in the victim's perception, that there is no tool or assessment that really is more effective than the victim's own experience and perception. They have been able to survive this abuser, and they know better than anyone how to continue to survive. And so we want to make sure that we're grounding our response always in what feels safest for them. And in particular with stalking, that we are paying attention to what does not feel safe for them. So we are listening to their own experiences first and foremost. So as I mentioned earlier, with the SHARP assessment, it will give that narrative report, but it also provides some safety planning suggestions. And like I said, I don't think that that is meant to replace what you might currently be doing with the folks that you're working with, but maybe as a double check. Maybe you've already safety planned with a victim and you can go through this and see if there's anything that you have forgotten or not addressed, or maybe just a way to keep some of that information organized as well. So when we talk about risk factors in particular in stalking cases, how do we identify stalking cases that have higher risk for violence or lethality? One of the things, or 14 risk factors in general, but one of the things that SHARP assessment does is to look through the behaviors to identify when these risk factors are presenting themselves and how often they're presenting themselves. But in general, these are the things that we are kind of talking about when we talk about high-risk stalking cases. We're looking at that course of conduct. Is it escalating? Is the intensity of it increasing? We're considering our triggers, right? And I would argue if you are working with a person who has any involvement in the criminal legal system or the civil legal system that involves their abuser, they kind of have triggers automatically, right? Every single court date is a potential trigger. Every time that they're having to engage, they're forced to engage with that abuser is a potential trigger. So making sure that we're paying attention to that. those contexts of threats, what the abuser is saying that he or she is going to do, their ability to follow through with that, their capability of it. We do want to kind of consider the stalker's history. If they have training in using weapons in combat, those are things that we might need to be paying attention to specifically as an increase in risk. If there is a criminal history, a mental health history, a substance abuse history, again, those are kind of those red flags that we should be collecting and paying attention to. And these might also be good roadmaps for you as you are working with a victim of stalking, asking questions about the relationship, about the dynamic, and about their experience. Just big picture categories that you need to be addressing or asking about to make sure that we're understanding the risk that this individual might be facing. So when we talk about individuals who have experienced stalking, the impact on victims and the impact of stalking specifically, we kind of recognize a unique form of trauma and victimization. One reason is because we see this, as this researcher kind of described it, this lack of response, right? There's kind of this view that victims of stalking have this mild trauma, that there is no overt harm or crime that is happening. And when we have that dismissiveness or lack of recognition within our community, that kind of compounds the trauma that a victim might be experiencing. We also see individuals who've experienced stalking have kind of that complex trauma reaction in that they are gearing up to survive traumatic events, knowing that the traumatic events are going to continue, that they have no ability to stop it. And so that can really have kind of a unique effect on an individual and cause a unique form of trauma and victimization for that person. So as I mentioned, the majority of close to the majority of stalking victims have that fear of not knowing what will happen next. And I almost kind of hate that description because I feel like it's such a kind of weak way to describe the fear that the victim is actually experiencing, truly not knowing what's going to happen next. And that means that no place is safe. You don't know if the victimization will occur in your home or your school or your church or the grocery store. There is no safety. There is no sanctuary. There is no peace. Ever. And living in that constant state of fear can really contribute to some hypersensitivity, right? That they might be constantly assessing their environment and their surroundings, and the presentation of that to our responders, to our community members might look extreme. Kind of goes back to that video that we showed at the very beginning. It might be hard for people outside of the experience to understand what's actually happening. So you see there too, not to overlook the other fears that victims have, because all of those are legitimate as well. I just think it's important for us to really understand the terror, the pervasive terror that victims of stalking live under. We heard one researcher describe it as it's like homicide in slow motion, right? That you are at that point in a scary movie that is right before the killer enters the room, right? Tension is high, your heartbeat is racing, your heart's racing, you are sitting on the edge of your seat, and that is their constant reality and how damaging and effective that might be. And as I mentioned, a really effective way to control and to exert abuse over another individual. So we want to make sure that we're educated on the way that trauma might present, how victims might cope with that trauma, with that level of fear and terror that is in their life. And so sometimes we might have victims who are disclosing that they are afraid, right? That they live in terror. Oftentimes, though, we have victims who are presenting in ways that on the surface maybe don't make sense. I've worked with a lot of victims who their response, what they are most comfortable with communicating to advocates and to law enforcement, is that they're angry, they're frustrated, right? I've worked with a victim before who said, they were experiencing stalking behavior, and their response was, if this guy shows up at my house again, I'm just going to kill him, right? And that was a statement made that it seemed to be fueled by a lot of anger, understandably so. But if you really started to dig into that statement, you recognize the fear that was sitting underneath that response. And what I heard from the victim was they are so affected by the stalking behavior that they're preparing themselves to take another human's life. That's how extreme it is. They are preparing themselves to do, one of the most dramatic things a person could do. And so we want to make sure, particularly as advocates, that we are sometimes digging through those layers of response, and we're helping to identify the underlying fear. And that's not necessarily to force that victim to acknowledge that they're fearful. I don't think there's necessarily value in that. But particularly with our partners, if we have a victim who's articulating that response, an angry response to law enforcement, and law enforcement says, well, they're not scared, right? They're ready to throw down. We actually have the opportunity to educate our partners to say, no, this is an extreme reaction. And this is evidence of the effect that this behavior is having on this person. So thinking through all of the ways that trauma specifically can present, and that we are prepared to understand that, to recognize it, and to educate our partners in the moment about the reality behind these presentations. So when we work with folks, as we mentioned earlier, we are grounding our response and our advice in their own experience and their perception. Oftentimes with stalking cases, the kind of knee-jerk response from first responders would be disengagement, right? Log off Facebook, block his number, do what you need to do to create distance between you and the offender. And while we do kind of overall, in general, advise disengagement, we also recognize that that might not be the safest move for a victim. And when we advise disengagement, we do so intentionally and with a lot of conversation with the victim. We make sure that we are understanding the dynamics of the abuse and helping the victim identify if disengagement will be a trigger for that person, if it might contribute to escalation of their behaviors. And we also are prepared to educate our criminal legal partners about why a victim might not completely disengage. This is not really a great analogy, but I always get stuck with this. I think sometimes our criminal legal partners might see victims reaching out to offenders as proof that the victim's not scared, right? Well, she called him, he called her. They're not scared. They're not victims. But the reality is, and again, this is a weak analogy, but if you'll stick with me, if a victim has been engaging and in a relationship with an abusive person for an extended period of time, particularly if that person is violent and dangerous, then that person, the victim, is kind of similar to a professional trainer, a tiger trainer, right? They know how to work with this dangerous animal. They have learned how to manage the violence, the potential danger of this person, and they have figured out all of the nuances. They understand better than anyone how to navigate this person's violent behavior. And so sometimes when our community steps in, we tell the tiger trainer, hey, we can't take you out of the cage necessarily, but what we want you to do is just pretend the tiger's not there, And it's not really a reasonable ask on our end to say, you need to cut off all communication. if the communication or the information that the victim is getting actually promotes their safety. So be prepared to understand that dynamic, but also explaining that dynamic to your prosecutors or to your law enforcement partners who maybe are negating cases because the contact that the victim's making. I might even argue, if the victim's making contact, that this is something we need to be paying more attention to, because that victim is making that contact to promote his or her own safety. So there might be some real lethality or some high risk factors in those cases specifically. So as we've talked about, as we have worked through all of this information, in general, when we talk about working with victims of stalking, we want to promote their safety first and foremost. We want to make sure that they are identifying the stalking behaviors in their own life and they understand the risk factors that can be associated with that. We want to take the information that we have about stalking and about these dynamics to share with our community partners so that our response as a whole can better identify and respond to stalking. We do need to help support our victims with the documentation of stalking behaviors, because this crime is unique, that it requires that course of conduct. We know that there's going to be, for the most part, an extended period of time. We want to support our victims in documenting what they're experiencing and try to lift that burden from them as much as we can, and providing that support in a number of ways, and ways that are, intentional and specific for the person we're working with. We talked a little bit about safety planning already, but we want to make sure that we are individualizing those safety plans, that we're working through the components or the parts of the safety plan that will work for the victim, right? There's no one safety plan fits all, that we're being very intentional and individualized with our safety plan. Our basic big picture considerations, and again, I know I'm speaking to the experts here, so this is probably common knowledge, but making sure that we're balancing that safety and freedom for the folks that we're working with, that we're not contributing to control dynamics or abusive dynamics by taking things away from the victim, that we're promoting their safety, but that we also are anticipating what the stalker's reaction or behavior might be based on the choices in the safety plan. And really communicating with our victims specifically that safety plans should evolve, right? Every time things change, time passes, events happen, that we're revisiting that safety plan and we are looking at what needs to be tweaked, changed, that we're being very intentional about the responsiveness to the victim situation in the moment. This is a resource that's on our site that we share with anyone, but particularly for our victim service partners, they can use this as they are working with victims. And this just helps focus kind of the information that needs to be reported. Oftentimes, individuals who are experiencing stalking behaviors, they're told by law enforcement, by prosecutors, by advocates, will just document everything, right? With no real follow-up or explanation of what they're supposed to be documenting or how, or what information should be included. So this just gives some structure and some guidance to victims so that they can collect the information that will help advocates and law enforcement respond, but also excludes information that could potentially be harmful or damaging. So specifically, we don't want our victims to be documenting how the stalking behaviors made them feel, because we know that victims of crime very rarely forget how they felt from their victimization, but B, we don't want this information to end up in the stalker's hands, particularly if there is a criminal legal case and it has to be turned over to the defense. We don't want to give the stalker information on what was their most effective tool, right? So we want to make sure that we're keeping that out of this narrative specifically and helping kind of the victim hyper-focus. So we are wrapping up here, and I just want to run through, in general, some big picture recommendations that we might have for your community or your partners to really help raise the awareness and the response to stalking crimes within your area. So one of the things we would always encourage is building off of those coordinated community response structures that you might already have. You might be sitting on multidisciplinary teams. There might be fatality review teams in your community. There might be specific CCRs to certain dynamics and certain crimes within your system. So as much as possible, and when appropriate, including the crime of stalking in those conversations. For example, in a domestic violence fatality review, we want to make sure we're identifying if stalking was occurring within that victimization and within that case that maybe is being evaluated in the team. It's really important that we do that so that we can not only improve our response, but we can also start to generate buy-in from our legal partners, helping them understand and see in real time why this is an issue that affects your community. So in general, we talk about, providing training, taking a look at your policies and procedures within your own agency or your partner agencies. You can go through our victim service checklist is on our website that just is kind of a little bit of an audit for the services that you provide, or maybe for the way that you are promoting your services or promoting your agency in your community, just to make sure that you are receptive and open to individuals who have been affected by stalking specifically. We have law enforcement strategies on our site as well. If you are partnering with law enforcement in your community and they need resources, they need help on identifying and responding to stalking cases, we have sample policies and procedures. We have roll call videos. We have lots of guides and resources that are available to them. And as I mentioned earlier, we also provide resources and training to prosecutors specifically to help kind of strategize about charging and successfully prosecuting stalking cases and the benefit of that. And so, we talked a little bit earlier with the great question that we had about why it may benefit a prosecutor long-term to be charging stalking every time that they can. But there's also nuanced reasons that stalking charges can benefit prosecutors that might be relevant to the course of conduct, being able to introduce and include evidence in the cases that we're trying that otherwise would not be included. So there's a lot of really great information on there that you can provide to your partners and hopefully can continue to improve your community's response. And as I'd mentioned, this kind of all lives on our site. You can access these resources and take a look at them. As I mentioned earlier, our advocacy checklist kind of walks through all of the things that you might be doing within your own agency to make sure that you're incorporating and involving stalking victimization in your response. This is that checklist just to show you that it exists. There's a guide for advocates. And this is just a reminder again of where all of that stuff lives. So you can find all of that online. You can find a lot of our webinars, a lot of our trainings live online and on our YouTube channel. And so if you haven't gotten enough today, which would be pretty amazing, you can log on and learn more. And they're not all coming from me. So that's the benefit. We use all of the wonderful experts on our staff to provide these trainings. And you can dig into some of the trainings that maybe are specific to your area or the questions that you might be having. And you are welcome to reach out to me directly. So we are a fierce army of 5 here at SPARC. So if you talk to one of us, you pretty much talk to all of us. So if you have a question, reach out. And if I can't answer it, I will check with smarter brains who can get you an answer. And we hopefully and ideally want to provide you with the support that you need to make your job easier. I mentioned earlier before the webinar started, I always love the opportunity to talk with advocates in the field. Having done that work for a brief moment of time, I have great appreciation for the work that you guys do and recognize you guys as the real heroes in our society. So anything that we can do to make your job easier and better and more effective, let us know. We're here for that, and we're happy to help in any way that we can. And I don't know if there were any other questions, but Oh, I did have one more. Patty, do we have time to answer questions or do we need to wrap up?
We are at overtime,
Okay.
unfortunately. But thank you so much, Natalie. This has been great. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. And many thanks to our wonderful interpretation and captioning team. Please follow at NRCDV on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn to learn about our new resources and upcoming events. This webinar was made possible by a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, the Office of Family Violence Prevention and Services. The contents of this webinar are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Please be sure to respond to our brief survey about this session using the link shared in the chat, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.